Welcome, everyone. Before I start, I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself. I attended Lewis and Clark College, where I majored in elementary education. And while I was in college, I went on an overseas study program to Japan, and I did my independent study project on child discipline in Japan. Immediately upon graduating from Lewis and Clark, I took my Montessori training from Miss Lena Wickramatne. I am very grateful that I took my training from her because she was a friend and colleague of Montessori. And as a matter of fact, Miss Lena and Maria Montessori worked together and lived together for 10 years after Montessori fled Italy during World War II. After that, I taught Montessori for over 40 years, and during that time, I co-owned and co-operated 2 Montessori schools, one with my best friend and one with my husband. My husband and I have recently retired, and I have written 2 books called Montessori, Why It Matters for Your Child's Success and Happiness, and it has a chapter on discipline, which relates to this talk, and also a children's book called Your Life Belongs to You, which is something that I taught to the children in my classroom. I am really glad to be here, and I want to thank the Ayn Rand Institute for giving me this opportunity to talk about discipline, because I love kids, and this is a very important topic to me. Discipline is usually thought of as punishment, but discipline is not punishment. I define it as training which corrects and strengthens behavior. Discipline can be used to teach a child the difference between right and wrong, to help him develop self-control, to persuade him to change his behavior, and to keep him safe. The end goal is for the child to ultimately achieve independence so that he can reason and act on his own. A well-behaved child respects himself, respects the rights of others, respects property, obeys the rules set up to enforce that respect, and has manners. The purpose of my talk is to contrast my view on discipline, which is based on the Montessori method, with the positive discipline method, and explain why Montessori's approach is the right one. As I talk, keep in mind that my focus is on the child age 2 to 6 years of age, so that's my main focus. And I am talking about the normal child, not the child with exceptions. Please hold your questions until the end. To begin, I want to tell you about some of the experiences that I had during my teaching career. Many years ago, another Montessori teacher came to observe my classroom. At the end of the observation time, I asked her if she had any questions. And she said, "Your kids, your children, they're so calm." And she went on to tell me that she had a group of children who misbehaved every day. They were a disruption to the entire class. They terrorized everyone by kicking and hitting and running. They abused the materials by swinging the Montessori chains around, the counting chains. She was never able to make any presentations without constant interruptions. And she told me she really needed help in the area of discipline. So I asked her, "Well, have you ever tried putting those children in timeout?" "Oh, I couldn't do that," she said, "because then everybody would know that they were naughty." Some years later, we had employed Montessori teachers in training who were told by their instructors not to put children in timeout. Redirection, or diverting the child's attention away from what he is doing in order to change the misbehavior, was to be used instead. And teachers were never to draw attention to any child who misbehaved. Words like no and don't were to be avoided. And teachers were told to either ignore misbehavior or to negotiate with the child. I witnessed classes dissolving into chaos, with teachers following unruly children around the room, endlessly redirecting them to find work. I saw more and more parents who wanted to shield their child from anything unpleasant, Teachers continuously received phone calls from parents worried that their child had encountered something uncomfortable, such as a falling out with a friend on the playground, or parents who expressed undue concern that their child had to sit in timeout. In the hallways, when a child treated his parent with disrespect, the parent would stand timidly nearby, trying to talk their child into cooperating instead of correcting the rudeness. It was like discipline had become a bad word. This approach to dealing with children is often referred to as positive discipline. Positive discipline has its roots in the ideas of Rudolf Dreikurs. Most people remember Dreikurs because of his contribution of logical consequences for misbehavior. But there are two major problems with Dreikurs. First, he thought that human misbehavior is the result of feeling a lack of belonging of one's social group. And secondly, he thought that the adult should withdraw as an authority figure. Jane Nelson based her approach on Dreikurs, and in her book, Positive Discipline, she states that the primary goal of all human beings is to feel a sense of belonging and significance. She goes on to say that behavior is reliant on how a child sees himself in relation to others and how he thinks others feel about him. If a child feels a sense of connection to community, family, and school, he is less likely to misbehave. Family and classroom meetings should be used for behavior problems where all children have an input. Rules are voted upon, and when rules are broken, another meeting is planned. Her approach advocates redirection for all negative behavior, and a child should not be made to feel bad for a wrongdoing. While logical consequences can be used, adults frequently use them to punish children, so they should be used as infrequently as possible. Children should have a choice as to whether they want to go into timeouts, where they should be allowed to do something fun. Alfie Kahn, author of Punished by Rewards, takes a wonderful blast at behaviorism in this book, which I loved. But he thinks that during discipline situations, the adult should not be the authority. He takes the position that when a child misbehaves, instead of using consequences, the child and the adult should come up with a solution together. He thinks if the child is allowed to negotiate, if he has a say, he will be more likely to cooperate. Montessori had a completely different view. Rather than the child feeling the need to fit in, Montessori observed that the child felt driven to learn about objective reality, and she provided an environment conducive for him to do so. Her method is unique because the child's work was what gave him the means to develop self-discipline. Once he acquired internal control and independent understanding of the real world, through his work, he would develop self-confidence and behave. But until that time, the child needs help from the adult. Becoming self-disciplined is a process that happens over a continuum. In our Montessori training class, discipline from the adult was likened to a kite. Think of the kite as the child and the string as a gentle guiding hand of the adult. When the child exhibits maturity and responsibility, you let the string to the kite out. But when the child misbehaves, you pull the string back in. While the child is growing up, the adult is constantly adjusting the length of the string, letting it out, pulling it in, letting it out, pulling it in, until the child reaches adulthood and you can completely let it go. This kite analogy definitely puts the adult in the position of authority. This is an important principle. The adult is the authority. And although in Montessori school, the child is free to make choices which are important for him, in order to develop independence. The adult still carefully observes and monitors his development. The child isn't left just completely free to do whatever he wants whenever he wants. Montessori viewed that as abandonment. Montessori said, quote, "A teacher of experience never has grave disorder in her class because before she draws aside to leave the children free, she watches and directs them for some time, preparing them in a negative sense. That is to say, by eliminating their uncontrolled movements," end of quote. She thought that useless or dangerous acts, quote, "must be suppressed, destroyed," end of quote. Montessori most definitely didn't think that misbehavior should be ignored. She was an advocate of solid, strong discipline. She had definite views on how children should behave, and when they did misbehave, children were directly and firmly confronted and corrected. Now, confront in this context does not mean to get in their face and start a fight. You know, a lot of people, when they think of that word, it has kind of a negative connotation. But in this context, it just means you face the child with the wrongdoing. You name it to him. In her book, The Montessori Method, she states, quote, "When the teachers were wary of my observations, they began to allow the children to do whatever they pleased. I saw children with their feet on the tables or fingers in their noses, and no intervention was made to correct them. I saw others push their companions, and I saw on the faces of these an expression of violence, and not the slightest attention on the part of the teacher. Then I had to intervene to show with what absolute rigor it is necessary to hinder and little by little suppress all those things which we must not do, so that the child may come to discern clearly between good and evil," end of quote. When children misbehaved, Montessori advocated intervention. If at this stage there is, quote, "If at this stage there is some child who persistently annoys the others, the most practical thing to do is interrupt him. It is true that we have said and repeated often enough that when a child is absorbed in his work, one must refrain from interfering. Nevertheless, the right technique now is just the opposite. It is to break the flow of disturbing activity." In addition to intervention, her schools used consequences. If a child was careless and dropped some work and made a mess, the consequence was to clean it up. When children misbehaved, timeouts were used as consequences. The children in Montessori are also given specific lessons in social graces, which they practice, such as how to talk to someone when you are upset with them, how to say "excuse me," and so on. In comparing the positive discipline approach to Montessori, there are significant differences. One is indirect and tries to shield the child from his wrongdoing. The other is direct, honest, and confrontive. One is democratic, where the adult withdraws as an authority and the children vote on solutions. In the other, the adult is authoritative, but gives children freedom within a specific framework of limits. One does not believe in using consequences and advocates redirection instead. The other one does use consequences. One thinks the child needs social acceptance in order to behave. The other one holds the child behaves when he gains self-control through his work. When determining whether or not a discipline method is valid, you have to examine its view of the child and his nature. This is crucial because if the child is not understood, the discipline approach will be flawed. The discipline approach, the positive discipline approach, is not based on the nature of the child. In other words, its premises are wrong. Montessori was right. The primary focus should be on the development of the child's mind, for that is what gives him his sense of self, and hence his self-confidence. The child shouldn't have to worry about whether he's accepted by the group. And I would add that by accepting the premise that a child should feel like he belongs to a group in order to act properly, adults are putting him in a position where he is expected to submit to peer group pressure. Therefore, if the group is misbehaving, so will the child that wants to be accepted by that group. Furthermore, I have witnessed small groups of children, good buddies, who create havoc together, and the leaders of those groups who act emboldened because they have followers. I have also seen children who are loners, and they're very well behaved. So much for the notion that children misbehave when they don't feel like they belong to their social group. Now, here are some actual reasons for misbehavior. The most basic and the most important one is that the child cannot fully reason like an adult. The child is very tied to concretes. He lives in the here and now. He cannot think long range. He doesn't understand cause and effect. I can't tell you how many times I have told children, put on your coat, it's cold outside, and they won't make a move to do it. From their perspective, they're not cold, so why should they put on their coat? A child can reason within his own world. He can take two objects, and he can count them, and he can take two more objects, and he can count them, and he can come up with the conclusion that 2 + 2 = 4. But he can't foresee that if he runs out into the street, he could be hit by a car and die. He can't project into the future. He hasn't experienced or may not have witnessed trauma. He has no idea what speed means or how to stop it. He has no idea that death is permanent, and so on. The child wants his own way, and he doesn't have enough conceptual knowledge yet to understand all the reasons why he's being told to stop doing what he wants to do. To not recognize that a child doesn't have the same context as an adult is to invert the hierarchy of knowledge. This is a massive mistake. Another mistake that adults make is to assume that the child fully understands reality. But he doesn't. He's figuring it out. The reason why the baby in the high chair watches as he repeatedly keeps throwing things down is because he wants to see what will happen. Will it go down each time? The child tests reality. He wants to know if reality will change. Is it what he perceives it to be? Since the adult is a part of reality, the child will also test the adult to see what reaction he gets. When I was about 5 years old, I was sitting next to my dad in the car, and I looked up at him while he was driving, and I thought to myself, I wonder what he would do if I yanked on that steering wheel. So I reached up. Now you guys are going to think I was a really bad kid, but I wasn't. I reached up, and I yanked on it, and he goes, oh, Charlotte, don't you do that. We could get in a car accident. Oh, that's just a horrible thing to do. I mean, he just went ballistic. So we're sitting there a while later, and I was in the front seats, because back then we didn't even have seat belts. And I looked up and I thought to myself, I wonder if he'd react the same way if I did it again. And yes, I got the exact same reaction. The child wants to know if adults and rules are consistent or do they change. A child may be testing reality and not be misbehaving. A toddler may jump on the couch, but be unaware of the danger to himself and the potential damage to the couch. He isn't being naughty because he has no knowledge of the danger or consequences, but he still may need discipline in order to get him to stop. Children know that adults know more than they do, and they look to us for guidance as to what is dangerous, right, wrong, and so on. Eliminating the adult as the authority would put the adult and child on equal footing. If adults and children were on equal footing, the child would have no need to be raised or educated by an adult. But children need adults who have more knowledge to correct them, protect them, and keep them safe. Therefore, limits make children feel secure. But the limits need to be set by adults, not a democratic vote. Can children suggest new rules or request that a rule be removed or changed? Can there be a class or a family meeting to discuss problems? Well, of course. But it is still the adult that makes the final decision regarding the rules, and it is the adult who enforces those rules. It is the adult who has the long-range knowledge about what children need to learn and do in order to develop a moral code and develop the qualities required for their long-range survival and happiness. When a child is misbehaving and the adult does not take charge, the child can manipulate him. Often the adult has no idea what's going on and unknowingly keeps catering to the child. If the child learns that he can get by with stalling, he will. If he doesn't have to get dressed in the morning, he won't. If he fakes being sick so that he can stay home with mom, he will, if it worked. One time I asked a 3-year-old boy why he was naughty with his mother. You know what he said? He's 3 years old. He said, "Because I get what I want." Before taking disciplinary action, the adult must first evaluate the context. Safety and property destruction issues need to be dealt with immediately. Ignoring a destructive or unsafe act instead of saying no is ineffective. My first year working in Minnesota, I was an assistant under another teacher. There was a boy who terrorized the class. He would pick a shelf and walk on top of it. If any of you have ever seen a Montessori classroom, you know that we have materials on all the shelves. And, some of them are breakable. Anyway, this is very dangerous. And the head teacher was a good teacher generally, and she was good at discipline in a general way, but she didn't know how to handle children like this. Well, she had heard the theory that you should ignore children who misbehave. So she ignored him. And surprise, surprise, not only did it not get any better, it got worse. He started walking on all the shelves in the room. He had on cowboy boots and he was stomping around. And not only that, as he did it, he was grinning from ear to ear. So he knew what he was doing. In other cases, redirection may be a valid intervention. If the adult sees a potential problem brewing that he thinks won't end well, like children are running in an unsafe space, or maybe you're a teacher in a classroom and you see some kids starting to run or rove, and you can see that this isn't going to end well. Either somebody's going to get hurt or something. So you redirect them and you say, go run outside instead, or you better find some work. However, that redirection is fine, but if they ignore you, you don't redirect again. You got to take action. You got to stop it right then, or they won't listen to you. Taking charge, however, does not mean that the adult intervenes in each and every circumstance. It is often best not to intervene when there is no danger or possibility of a serious outcome, and the child can learn from the natural consequences of his choices and actions. When our oldest daughter was 3 years old, she and I went shopping. She wanted to bring a toy into the store. I advised her not to, because I said, you might lose it. Well, she brought it in anyway, and yeah, she lost it. So we get back to the car. She wants to go back in the store and look for it. So we go back in the store, we look for it. She asked all the different clerks if they had seen her toy, and she couldn't find it. So I did not buy her a replacement toy, and she felt very sad. Fast forward 7 years. She's now 10 years old, and we go shopping, and this time her younger sister is along, and her younger sister wanted to take a toy into the store. You'll never guess what Cassie said to her. Don't do it. Consequences are a very effective type of discipline because children learn firsthand. Since young children cannot think long range, they learn that their actions have results, and they learn to think ahead. There are two types of consequences, natural and logical. A natural consequence happens without adult participation, whereas the logical consequence is instituted by the adult and imposed on the child. A natural consequence for running out into the street without looking would be to get hit by a car. But when the natural consequence is too dangerous, or if it doesn't work, then the adult should set up logical consequences. Interestingly, even though Dreikurs thought that the adult should withdraw as the authority figure, the idea of logical consequences came from him, and he thought that the logical consequence should somehow relate to what the child did. So, for example, if the child runs out into the street without looking for cars, the natural consequence would be to ban him from playing in the front yard. Logical consequences also have to relate to the individual child. A logical consequence may be to send him to his room, but if he loves going there, then you got to choose someplace else. The adult needs to find what works for each individual child. But whatever is done, the adult should always be prepared to follow through with the consequences that have been set up. Because if he doesn't follow through, the child will cease listening to him. For that reason, consistency is vital to good discipline. The adult should also be firm, but firm isn't the same as being mean. Firm means that you're serious and you mean what you say. One year, when I was in college, I came home for Christmas vacation, and I visited my brother. My brother was married, and he had 2 children, 2 boys, a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. We were coming home from some event, and they were in the back seat. Oh, they were fighting and loud and very disruptive. So my brother said, "You guys have got to resolve your fight. You know, you got to stop." Well, they didn't stop. So then he said, "If you don't stop your fighting, you're going to have to walk home." They ignored him, and they kept fighting. So he stops the car, opens the door. The boys get out. They're grumbling and mumbling. And as you can see, it was in the wintertime, but it wasn't so cold that they would get frostbite. And the snow was, kind of deep. But it was a country road, so there was no traffic. But, as a precautionary measure, my brother drove the car right next to them as they walked. They walked 3 blocks home. And you know what? It was very peaceful in the car after that when we went somewhere. The logical consequence timeouts were used in Montessori's original schools with success. Montessori stated, quote, "As far as punishments are concerned, we frequently found ourselves confronted with children who disturbed others, but who would not listen to our entreaties. We immediately had them examined by a physician, but very often they turned out to be normal. We then placed a little table in a corner of the room, and there isolating the child, we made him sit in an armchair where he could be seen by his companions, and gave him all the objects he desires. This isolation always succeeded in calming the child. From his position, he could see all of his companions, and their way of acting was an object lesson in behavior more effective than words of his teacher could have been. Little by little, he came to realize the advantages of being with the others and to desire to act as they did. In this way, we imparted discipline to all the children who at first had seemed to us to be rebels. I do not know what happened within the souls of the isolated children, but certainly their conversions were always true and lasting. End of quote. Timeouts are under fire in the positive discipline camp. They view them as punitive, but timeouts are not punitive. Timeouts are not done by putting the child up in front of the class with a dunce hat on so that all the kids can laugh at them. No, that's not how it's done. And you don't put them in a position where they're suffering. Well, all you do is you give him a spot to sit down so that he can calm down and get control of himself. By sitting in one spot, he can think about his actions while observing the proper behavior of the other children. Timeouts appeal to the child's mind. Think of how many times as adults, you get upset about something and your friend comes and says, count to 10, take a break. This is like the same, we're training them how to get control of themselves. So why is this such a big deal? Critics worry that timeouts can create social problems for the offending child, as did the Montessori teacher who observed my classroom. But she didn't put disruptive children in timeout for fear that everybody would know that they were naughty. Oh, come on. You really think nobody knew they were being naughty? Her motive was to shelter the misbehaving children by trying to hide the fact that they were misbehaving, rather than correct their inappropriate actions and protect the well-behaved children. She was more worried about social problems than moral development and safety. And guess what? It isn't timeouts that create social problems for the naughty child. It is the child's own behavior, coupled with the lack of discipline. When the teacher spends all her time tending to the naughty children, the well-behaved children resent it. And when something isn't done to stop misbehavior, the entire class is disrupted, and the children feel violated. They can't work, and they're afraid. And I've seen that firsthand. I saw that with the boy who was walking on the shelves. The children were very frightened. But when the offenders are removed, they feel safe. The class can carry on. They're free to learn again, now that the disruption has been stopped. And the focus shifts from the misbehaving children to the well-behaved children. And one more thing, the well-behaved children no longer feel threatened by the wrongdoers, so they can still be friends with them. Some people think that if a child is continuously disciplined, no one will like him, as if it were the discipline that was affecting the children's affections for each other, rather than the child's own behavior. But it is correction that helps children socially. We had a 6-year-old student at school who was choking other children. It was very serious. So serious, we thought, if this continues, we're going to have to dial 911. So we called the mother into the office, and we told her our plan. We wanted to isolate her child. We would give him his own table for 3 months. He was to stay there to do his work and couldn't get up without permission. The mother was upset because she thought he would conclude he was naughty and it would damage his self-esteem. She thought that the other kids wouldn't like him, as if they liked him now. We told her that the safety of the children was our top priority, so either he would need to be isolated or he would have to leave the school. Well, fortunately, she loved Montessori, so she consented to the plan. Toward the end of the 3 months, when it was time to give him his freedom again, he asked his mother, "Are my 3 months almost over?" "Yes," she said. He proceeded to get very upset. "What's wrong?" his mom asked. Why are you upset?" "When I am working at my table, I don't hurt anybody. I don't want to leave my table." Telling him no gave him the boundaries he needed to start controlling himself. As I heard someone else say, a child needs to hear the word no said to him so that he can say it to himself later. I now want to shift gears a little bit and talk about choice making. Adults need to allow children to make choices so that they can develop independence and self-confidence. But the choices offered to children need to be safe, age-appropriate, and commonsensical. A child cannot be given choices about things he knows nothing about. And asking him to do so makes him feel insecure. I frequently see adults make this mistake, like asking a 3-year-old what school he wants to go to. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. It just would drive me nuts. Children cannot have choices about everything. They cannot be allowed to decide whether or not to take medicine, to brush their teeth, to take a bath, to run out into the street, to wear a swimming suit to school. Yes, that happened. And so on. The challenge comes in deciding what to do when a child is given choices in a disciplinary situation and the child refuses them. You can either stop screaming or go to your room. The child may continue to scream without going to his room, in which case the adult has to follow through with the choices that were given and escort the child to his room. Sometimes the child will reject the choices that we give him and insist on one that is unacceptable. If the child continues to defy the adult, then he needs to be told that if he doesn't choose one of the options he was given, the adult will choose one for him. Similarly, you can only negotiate with a child over options that are negotiable. Consider this type of example. A child is jumping on the couch and the adult decides it is dangerous and tells him to stop. The child stomps his foot. I won't. The parent says, well, what would you like? The child says, extra snack, which is against house rules, but the parent agrees anyway. With this approach, the child learns how to manipulate people in order to get what he wants. It's okay to negotiate with children, but only with things that are negotiable, when both alternatives are okay. Jumping on the couch is not okay, nor is an extra snack. Children cannot be allowed to negotiate over danger or morality. This kind of negotiating is permissiveness dressed up. It gives the child the impression he has a choice when he does not. The message is he can keep on doing it until the adult gives him something. Another example is an older child, like around age 13. He refuses to clean his room, so the parent negotiates with him. The child knows that the parent doesn't like to cook, so the child suggests he fix dinner 2 nights a week in exchange for the parent cleaning his room. That kind of trade is not acceptable. The child needs to clean his room. It's his mess. It's his responsibility. And you know what? It doesn't matter that he doesn't want to do it. We all have things in life we don't want to do, but we do it anyway. The child has to learn that too. I think the popularity of the positive discipline approach is due to the fact that many people view discipline as punishment that will make a child feel sad and therefore squelch his self-esteem. There are 2 underlying premises here. One is that self-esteem comes from others, and therefore one should always present a positive view of the child to himself so that he can have high self-esteem. The second is that temporary sadness or negative emotions hurt self-esteem, and that this is what causes a child to behave poorly. Both views are false. First, as Montessori recognized, self-esteem does not come from others. The child has to earn it on his own, which takes time. The idea that saying no will hurt a child's self-esteem presupposes that that child already has self-esteem. A child who continues to misbehave by hitting, shoving, pushing, kicking, name-calling, and disrespecting others and property will not feel good about himself. So we need to use discipline in order to persuade him to change his behavior. Secondly, correction that makes a child sad will not hurt his self-esteem. Feeling sad can be a constructive emotion. Emotions are a result of value judgments that a person has made. And if a child judges that he has behaved poorly, well, he should feel bad about it. How else can a child learn the difference between right and wrong unless he feels uncomfortable when he does something wrong? To deny a child that is to deny him the development of a conscience. And if he doesn't develop a conscience, there is no self-esteem to be had. Now I want to share with you a personal story that illustrates how direct intervention affected one of our children. My husband and I always use the techniques that I advocate in this talk: consequences, timeouts, encouraging and allowing acceptable choices, and so on. And we were always consistent in our follow-through. But as you know, a child has free will, and when one of our kids was a teenager, she started to go down the wrong path. She was rejecting us and the values that we had tried to instill in her growing up. Trying to reason with her only ended in heartache explosions. Nothing was working. So, we ramped up the discipline. We completely cut her off from her friends. My husband called the cell phone company and set it up so that the only people she could call or receive calls from was family. Then we took all our landline phones and locked them in our bedroom. A few months later, she and I went to our cabin for 3 weeks. We were there alone, just the two of us. One night, as I was reading in bed, she knocked on my door. "Mom, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure." "You know," she began, "when you and Dad cut me off from my friends, that was the best thing you ever did. Because I no longer had to worry about what my friends thought about me. It took all the pressure off so I could just concentrate on myself and what I thought about me." I was stunned. Just a few months prior, she had screamed at the top of her lungs that we were the worst parents in the world, and I had fretted that she was a lost cause. Now today, as an adult, she tells us that we are her heroes because we didn't let her get by with her immoral behavior. The reason why children love strong disciplinarians is because they feel cared about. The adult cared enough about me to help me behave. But if the child is always presented with a positive view of himself, even when he is doing negative things, he isn't helped. He is actually hindered. How can we expect him to make a correction when he doesn't know he's done anything wrong? He has no way of distinguishing right from wrong and has no guidelines for changing. We shouldn't give him the view that everything he does is wonderful, and we are lying to him if we do. It is not wonderful when he misbehaves. Part of growing up is learning to deal with the fact that you can't always do just whatever you feel like doing. By not saying no, adults send a child the message that everything in life will go just as he wants, no matter what he does, and that's not reality. One can't assume that the child completely understands when he is told why he shouldn't do something. It takes time for the brain to mature. And from what I have read, the reasoning part of the brain is the last to fully develop. Even if a child does understand all the reasons, that doesn't mean he has the self-control to refrain from doing what he knows he shouldn't do. When a child doesn't listen and continues to misbehave, the adult has to take action. Then the child learns consequences. If I do A, then B could happen. Consistency and follow-through teaches the child logic. When behavior is ignored, it teaches children to evade the obvious facts of reality, to pretend they don't exist, rather than dealing with them forthrightly. By giving a child choices before he has the knowledge and maturity to be able to handle those choices, the child learns to operate on his emotions rather than rational thought. Positive discipline ignores the facts about the nature of the child, and therefore their approach stunts his growth. The risk is insecure, out of control, disrespectful children. I don't know about you, but I've seen it all over in our culture. Montessori had the right view of both the child's nature and the role of the adult in guiding him towards independence. Therefore, her view of discipline was correct and is still correct today. The purpose of discipline is not to make a child feel that you don't love him, but that you love him enough to take the actions required for him to learn the difference between right and wrong. The notion of not saying no to the child is wrong because discipline is not a bad word. It works. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, 10 minutes? It's pretty close.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. I wonder if you have any practical advice to educators who are Montessori educators or in the Montessori vein, and especially since my experience is that even with a lot of quite good Montessori trainings, they don't often cover discipline and classroom management in enough depth to kind of give the sense of the approach, especially in contrast to mistakes that they're almost certainly going to make. That you kind of laid out here, and a lot of Montessorians do turn towards positive discipline, and there are even seemingly some good ideas in positive discipline.
You know what? Unfortunately, that is the trend, not only in public schools, but in Montessori schools too. It's very, very concerning. But anyway, go ahead.
So the question is just, so what, I mean, are there particular people writing that you'd recommend? Are there kind of better and worse people within the positive discipline community, since it's a pretty big community at this point and a lot of people turn towards it? Just what would your advice be for an educator?
Well, that's difficult. I mean, what you're saying is true. In the Montessori training, they don't go into it in depth. I mean, like I said, in my training, they gave us the kite example and stuff. And then there's, of course, the quotes by Montessori in her books. And like Miss Lena and other trainers like that knew her and knew that she was very firm in that. And I think the reason why they don't go into it in depth in the Montessori training is because her training classes, most of them were held in Italy, in Europe. And those children are different than our children, from what I've heard. Our children are very assertive. And the children in Europe, now, again, this is what I've heard, they were to be seen and not heard. And so I guess, they figured they didn't really have to dwell on discipline a lot. So I don't really know what to advise you about that, except, I'm trying to get out to Montessori conventions and stuff and tell them this, to make them aware of this. And I'm kind of thinking about writing a book about it too, but there are some good books about discipline that you can read. For any of you who have teenagers, the book that I would recommend for you is called Why Do They Act That Way by David Walsh. And he talks about the brain and exactly what is happening in the brain and why teenagers lip off and why they take risks and all that kind of stuff. He's really good. And then there's other, I guess you just have to kind of search around and find. I could, tonight, I can see if I can come up with a list. Oh, by the way, we're having a meeting Tuesday morning where we'll be talking about applying Montessori at home and at school. So it's 7:30 Tuesday in the Laguana Sunset Room. So, if you want to come, then we could discuss more about that, and maybe you would have some ideas too.
That would be great. Thanks.
Hi, I was wondering, so I'm a new parent. We have a 2-year-old, and we've been trying to implement one of the ideas that we read in the Objective Standard, actually, in an article called, with our daughter, we're trying to implement some of the ideas we read in an article in the Objective Standard, one of which was I think it's called Parenting with the Master Question, and what they said is to try to give reasons for all of the limits that we set, so that we try to teach the child to do what's right for the right reasons, not just these are the rules, you have to follow them. To what extent do you think it's important to, as you're trying to develop the rational faculty, to give explanations for
You
the
always tell them the reasons, and when there are rules, you always, you tell them the reasons. You don't leave that out at all, but you can't expect that they're going to understand it in total like an adult does. They may understand part of it. And all kids are different too. Some kids might understand it all, but for the most part, most kids will not understand all those reasons, but that doesn't mean you don't tell them, because as they get older, they will start to understand, the reasons for that.
Thank you.
First, thank you very much for today, and it was a great talk. I'm just wondering, you talk a lot about some Montessorian teachers not necessarily doing things the best way. How can I differentiate between a good one and a bad one?
That's such a good question. I always suggest that people go observe. You have to go in and sit and look and watch for yourself. If the teachers are, like I've seen, chasing the kids around the room, go find work, go find work, go find work, and the kids aren't finding work, and there's no consequence, the children are just ignoring the teacher and there's no consequence given, then you have to judge and compare what different teachers do in their classrooms. And I think that would give you a good idea.
So shop around a bit?
Yeah.
I got you. All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hello, thank you. Do you think that there's an increasing trend in entitlement mentality today? And if so, do you think the positive discipline might play a causal role in this trend?
Oh, yeah. The two fit together so well. The children, it's just like these, when the parents are catering to the child being upset over every little thing, that just fits right into, well, they think that everything should go perfectly for them. These helicopter parents, they're rampant. They're just, they can't allow their child to feel sad. They can't allow them to make a mistake. They come and complain if their child, is upset about something. Not that they shouldn't be concerned. And if there is a real big concern, parents, yes, of course, we want them to come and talk to us so that we can resolve it. But, really, You're going to give the teacher a call because the child had a falling out with a friend on the playground? I mean, there's some things that you've got to let children learn. Yes, you're sympathetic and say, yeah, that's too bad. And you can talk to them about it, but there's way too much interference. And I don't know if that answered your question. I think I got off track, but
No, it did. Thank you.
As an educator, what do you think are some ways that we can bring sort of objectivist ideas into the classroom? Definitely not indoctrinating, but sort of presenting them with an alternative to what culture popularly says,
you mean to other educators?
to other educators and the students.
Well, with the students, it's pretty easy to do because the Montessori method is so based on reality. So, you know, you've got that going for you right there. And as far as to other educators, you just got to do the best you can to get the best ideas out there. I don't know quite how to answer that, except, you know, you could write articles or speak up at staff meetings and, you know, try to get your ideas in there the best you can.
As a completely separate question, could you talk a bit about your book for children, the one that you wrote?
The Montessori book? Well, do you want to know like the history of it or what?
Sure.
Okay, well, when I first started working, I worked at a parent-owned, parent-run school. And the parents there really liked Montessori, but they didn't understand how it works. So they said, would you write an article for the newsletter? And they'd pick a topic, so I would write it. And then they'd come and they'd say, well, could you please explain blah, blah, blah? You know, so I'd write it and they would put it in the newsletter. Well, as the years went by, I just kept doing that. And teachers and parents said, you've got to get that in a book. You've got to put all that in a book. Well, you know, yeah, that'd be really nice, but so then I met a publisher online, and I had written some articles for the American Thinker, and he really liked that. And when I found out that he was a publisher, then I said, hey, I didn't know you were a publisher, you know, what do you think of this? And he says, well, send me some stuff, and we'll see. So I sent it to him, he said, yeah, let's go for it. So, but yeah, it's about, I try to explain Montessori starting with the philosophy and the materials and the goal and all of that, and then all the various aspects of the Montessori method in kind of bite-sized pieces.
Thank you very much.
That's what I wanted. Oh yeah, who was asking how to get to the other educators? Give them my book.
Can I have a question? Time's up. Sorry, time's up.